Right now, as you watch this video, there are approximately 1.5 million children working in cocoa fields in West Africa. Most of them are between the ages of 5 and 17. They work with machetes. They carry loads heavier than their own body weight. They are exposed to agricultural chemicals without protective equipment. They do not go to school. Some of them were trafficked, taken from their families, sold, transported across borders, and put to work on farms they cannot leave. And the cocoa they harvest ends up in the chocolate bars sold by the largest confectionery companies on earth. Companies with revenues in the tens of billions of dollars. Companies that have known about this for decades. Companies that have signed agreements to end child labor in their supply chains, agreements that have been broken, renewed, and broken again, year after year, for over 20 years. The hidden curse of chocolate is not a secret. It has been documented, investigated, exposed, and published, and nothing has changed. But this story does not begin in West Africa. It does not begin in a cocoa field. It begins in a jungle in southern Mexico 3,000 years ago, with a bitter drink that was considered so sacred, so powerful, so dangerous, that only kings and warriors were permitted to taste it. And the journey from that sacred drink to the chocolate bar in your pocket is one of the darkest stories in the history of food. The cacao tree, Theobroma cacao, is one of the most unusual plants on Earth. Its name in the Linnaean system, given by the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus in 1753, means food of the gods in Greek. Linnaeus was not being poetic. He was recognizing what the civilizations of Mesoamerica had known for 3,000 years. The cacao tree grows only in a narrow band around the equator, in conditions of extreme heat and humidity, in the shade of larger trees in tropical forest. Its flowers, tiny, pale, almost invisible, bloom directly from the trunk and branches of the tree, not from its tips. This is unusual in the plant kingdom. The flowers must be pollinated by midges, tiny flies, in conditions of such specific humidity that cacao cultivation remains one of the most technically demanding forms of agriculture in the world. When pollinated, the flowers produce enormous elongated pods, football-shaped fruits that also grow directly from the trunk, each containing 30 to 50 seeds surrounded by a sweet white pulp. Those seeds are cacao beans. And for the Olmec people of the Gulf Coast of Mexico, who were likely the first to cultivate cacao around 1500 BC, they were not food, they were power. The Olmec passed their knowledge of cacao to the Maya, who built one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the pre-Columbian Americas. For the Maya, cacao was woven into the fabric of existence itself. Their creation myth, the Popol Vuh, describes the first human beings as being made from cacao. Their calendar included rituals dedicated to cacao. Their gods were depicted holding cacao pods. Cacao beans were used as currency, so valuable that counterfeiting them by filling empty husks with clay or sand was a serious crime. A Maya chocolate drink was not the sweet hot cocoa of the modern world. It was a cold, frothy, bitter liquid made from ground cacao beans, water, chili peppers, cornmeal, and various other spices. It was consumed at ceremonies marking births, deaths, marriages, and military victories. It was given to warriors before battle. It was offered to the dead. It was consumed in rituals that merged the human and divine. The word chocolate itself comes from the Nahuatl word zocolotl, which translates roughly as bitter water. The Aztec Empire, which absorbed and expanded on Maya civilization from the 14th century onward, elevated cacao to an even more extraordinary status. Only specific people were permitted to drink chocolate. The emperor, high priests, warriors of the highest rank, merchants of great wealth. Consuming chocolate without the appropriate social status was not just presumptuous. It was a transgression against the divine order. The Aztec emperor Moctezuma Tet reportedly consumed 50 golden goblets of chocolate daily, cold, flavored with chili and vanilla, frothed by pouring between vessels from a height to create the foam that was considered the most desirable part of the drink. Cacao beans were collected as tribute from conquered peoples. They filled the treasuries of the empire alongside gold and jade. When Spanish explorers first arrived in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in 1519, they found storehouses containing over 900 million cacao beans. The Aztec did not consider this strange. They were storing currency. They were storing the blood of civilization. They were storing the drink of gods. And the Spanish, looking at a dark, bitter liquid in golden cups, understood almost none of this. But they were about to steal all of it anyway. When Spanish forces under Hernán Cortés arrived in Mexico in 1519, they encountered a civilization of extraordinary complexity and sophistication. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, built on an island in a lake in the Valley of Mexico, was larger than any city in Europe at the time. Its markets were organized and abundant. Its engineering, including the causeways, aqueducts, and floating gardens, was astonishing. The Spanish were simultaneously impressed and determined to destroy it. Within 2 years, through a combination of military force, political manipulation of rival peoples, and most devastatingly smallpox, a disease to which the indigenous population had no immunity, the Aztec Empire had been dismantled. Moctezuma was dead. Tenochtitlan was in ruins, and the Spanish were systematically looting everything of value. They took the gold. They took the silver. They took the land. And among the things they took, almost as an afterthought, were cacao beans. The first cacao beans arrived in Spain in 1528, brought by Cortés himself. The Spanish court was not impressed initially. The drink, cold, bitter, spiced with chili, was deeply foreign to European palates. But someone, somewhere in the Spanish court, tried sweetening it with sugar, and adding heat, and removing the chili. And suddenly, the most sacred ritual drink of the Americas had been transformed into something Europeans could enjoy at court. The Spanish kept this transformation secret for nearly a century. They controlled the cacao supply from their American colonies. They refined the drink, sweetened it, and consumed it in their courts, while the rest of Europe knew almost nothing about it. When the drink eventually spread to France, Italy, and England in the 17th century, it spread as a luxury product of extraordinary expense. A fashionable chocolate house opened in London in 1657. By the 1660s, dozens of chocolate houses had opened across the city, frequented by politicians, merchants, writers, and aristocrats. Samuel Pepys wrote about drinking chocolate for breakfast. Charles II attempted to ban chocolate houses because he believed political conspiracies were being hatched in them. Chocolate had gone from the sacred drink of Aztec warriors to the fashionable beverage of European elites in a little over a century. But the cacao that went into every cup was grown by enslaved people, because the Spanish had a problem. The indigenous populations of the Americas, already devastated by disease, were dying faster than they could be forced to work. The solution was the Atlantic slave trade, and cacao plantations, alongside sugar and tobacco, became one of the primary drivers of that trade. The connection between chocolate and slavery began within decades of the Spanish conquest. Cacao cultivation in the Americas, on the islands of the Caribbean, and along the coasts of Central and South America required enormous amounts of human labor. The cacao tree is demanding and unpredictable. It must be grown in specific conditions of heat and humidity. It must be protected from disease and pests. Its pods must be harvested by hand. There is no mechanical method that works, with careful cuts to avoid damaging the tree. The seeds must be extracted from the pods, fermented for several days in wooden boxes, then dried, sorted, roasted, and ground. All of this is labor-intensive in the extreme. And all of it was performed in the Spanish colonial system by enslaved people. Initially, the Spanish attempted to enslave the indigenous population. The Taino people of the Caribbean were worked to death in such numbers that within a generation of Spanish arrival, their population had collapsed from an estimated several million to near extinction. The Spanish response was to import enslaved Africans. The first enslaved Africans arrived in the Caribbean in 1501. By the 17th century, the Atlantic slave trade was the largest forced migration in human history, and cacao was among the commodities that made it economically necessary to its perpetrators. On the cacao plantations of the Caribbean and South America, enslaved people worked from before dawn to after dark. They lived in conditions that were designed to extract maximum labor with minimum cost. They were fed the cheapest available food. They received no medical care. They could be punished for the smallest infractions in ways that were legally sanctioned and socially normalized. The death rates were catastrophic. And the response of the plantation system to high death rates was simply to import more enslaved people. The calculation was brutal and explicit in the records of the time. It was cheaper to work an enslaved person to death and replace them than to provide conditions under which they might survive. This was not an accident. It was an economic policy. And the chocolate consumed in European courts, parlors, and eventually the streets of every major city was produced within this system. Every cup of hot chocolate drunk by an English aristocrat in the 18th century was sweetened with sugar grown by enslaved people and flavored with cacao grown by enslaved people. The luxury of European civilization was built in part on the destroyed bodies of African people forced to work in tropical heat on the other side of the world. When slavery was eventually abolished in Britain in 1833, in the United States in 1865, in Brazil in 1888, the chocolate industry did not stop. It adapted. And what it adapted to was, in many ways, worse. In the early 19th century, chocolate was still a drink, a luxury drink available primarily to the wealthy, made from cacao ground and mixed with water or milk. Then, in 1828, a Dutch chemist named Coenraad van Houten invented a hydraulic press that could extract the fat, cacao butter, from ground cacao, leaving behind a dry cake that could be powdered. This powder, Dutch processed cocoa, was more soluble, more consistent, and easier to use than anything that had come before. And it changed everything. In 1847, the English confectionery company J.S. Fry & Sons combined cocoa powder, sugar, and melted cacao butter into a paste that could be molded and set. The first solid chocolate bar had been created. In 1875, Swiss chocolatier Daniel Peter added condensed milk, a recent invention of Henri Nestlé, to the chocolate mixture, creating milk chocolate. In 1879, Rodolphe Lindt invented the conching machine, a device that stirred chocolate continuously for days, breaking down particles to a fineness that produced the smooth, melt-in-the-mouth texture of modern chocolate. Within 50 years, chocolate had been transformed from a liquid luxury into a solid mass-market product. The companies that drove this transformation, Fry, Cadbury, Rowntree in Britain, Nestlé and Lindt in Switzerland, Hershey in the United States, became some of the most powerful consumer goods companies in the world. And as production scaled up, demand for cacao exploded. By the late 19th century, the Caribbean and South American plantations could no longer supply enough. The chocolate companies looked for new sources. They found them in West Africa. And what happened next in West Africa was not slavery in the legal sense, but it was slavery in every practical sense that mattered. Cacao was introduced to the island of São Tomé off the coast of West Africa by the Portuguese in the 1820s. It proved perfectly suited to the equatorial climate. By the late 19th century, São Tomé was one of the largest cacao producers in the world, and the labor system on São Tomé was called contract labor. In practice, it was indistinguishable from slavery. Workers were recruited, often through deception or outright coercion, from Angola and other Portuguese African territories. They were transported to São Tomé. Their contracts theoretically entitled them to wages and eventually repatriation. In practice, wages were minimal or withheld entirely on various pretexts. Repatriation almost never happened. Workers who tried to leave were returned by force. Those who resisted were punished. The death rates on the São Tomé plantations were extraordinarily high. In 1901, the journalist Henry Nevinson traveled to Angola and São Tomé to investigate. What he found and published in Harper's Magazine in 1905 was a detailed account of a slave trade operating under the name of contract labor. Nevinson's reporting caused a significant scandal in Britain. The Cadbury Company, one of the largest purchasers of São Tomé cacao, was directly implicated. Cadbury, founded by the Quaker Cadbury family and explicitly committed to ethical business practices, had been buying cacao from São Tomé for years. Their response to Nevinson's reporting was not to immediately stop. They launched an investigation. They sent representatives to São Tomé. They negotiated with the Portuguese colonial authorities. And for 7 years, while those negotiations continued, they continued buying São Tomé cacao. Eventually, in 1908, after sustained public pressure and a libel trial against a British newspaper that had accused them of hypocrisy, Cadbury and several other British chocolate companies boycotted São Tomé cacao. The Portuguese colonial authorities made cosmetic reforms, and within a few years things were much as they had been before, because the fundamental problem was not the Portuguese colonial system. The fundamental problem was that the economics of the chocolate industry required cheap labor, and cheap labor in tropical cacao-growing regions meant coerced labor. As the 20th century progressed, cacao production shifted increasingly to the newly independent nations of West Africa, primarily Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. These countries had real governments, real laws, and real commitments to the welfare of their citizens, but they were also very poor. Their farmers were very poor. And the global price of cacao was set not by the farmers who grew it, but by commodity markets in London and New York, controlled by traders and chocolate companies who had every incentive to keep prices as low as possible. The result was a system in which cacao farmers in West Africa, growing one of the most valuable food commodities on earth, lived in extreme poverty. And extreme poverty in a region where law enforcement was weak and economic desperation was absolute, created the conditions for child labor. And then, for something worse. In 2000, 2 journalists, Carol Off and Brian Woods, began investigating child labor in the West African cocoa industry. What they found in Côte d'Ivoire was a system of child trafficking operating at significant scale. Children, primarily from Mali, Burkina Faso, and other impoverished neighboring countries, were being recruited by traffickers with promises of paid work or educational opportunities. They were transported to Côte d'Ivoire. They were sold to cacao farmers, and they were put to work on farms that they could not leave. They worked from before sunrise to after sunset. They used machetes to harvest cacao pods. They carried heavy loads of harvested pods on their heads and backs. They were beaten if their work was considered insufficient. They received no pay. They had no way to contact their families. They did not know where they were. Some of them were as young as 5 years old. The documentary that Off and Woods produced, Slavery, A Global Investigation, was broadcast in Britain in 2000 and in the United States in 2001. It won international journalism awards. It caused a major political response. The United States Congress threatened to require chocolate products to be labeled as slave-free or not slave-free, forcing the industry to either verify its supply chains were free of child labor or admit to consumers that it could not. The chocolate industry responded by negotiating an alternative. In 2001, the major chocolate companies, including Nestle, Mars, Hershey, Cadbury, and others, signed what became known as the Harkin-Engel Protocol. They committed to eliminating the worst forms of child labor from their supply chains by 2005. The 2005 deadline passed. The child labor remained. The deadline was extended to 2008. The child labor remained. The deadline was extended to 2010. The child labor remained. In 2015, the United States Department of Labor reported that the number of children working in hazardous conditions in the cocoa fields of Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire had actually increased since the Harkin-Engel Protocol was signed. Not decreased, increased by 2020. A study commissioned by the United States Department of Labor found that approximately 1.56 million children were working in cocoa production in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. This was more than the number found when the Harkin-Engel Protocol was signed in 2001. 20 years of pledges, protocols, and programs had achieved the opposite of their stated goal. The children harvesting the cacao in your chocolate bar today are more numerous than the children who were harvesting it when the world found out about the problem and demanded it stop. Why has nothing changed? The answer is not complicated. It is economics. A cacao farmer in Côte d'Ivoire earns, on average, less than $1 per day. The global price of cacao is set by commodity markets that neither know nor care about the conditions of the farmers who grow it. When the global price of cacao falls, as it has done repeatedly due to oversupply, currency fluctuations, and market speculation, cacao farmers in West Africa earn even less. When a farmer earns less than $1 a day growing a crop that requires enormous labor, there is almost no ethical choice available. He cannot pay adult wages for all the labor required. He uses family labor, his children, or he uses cheaper labor, trafficked children. This is not a defense of the practice. It is an explanation of the system that makes it inevitable. The Nestle Corporation had revenues of approximately $95 billion in 2022. Mars Incorporated had revenues of approximately $45 billion. Hershey had revenues of approximately $10 billion. The total income of all the cacao farmers in Côte d'Ivoire, the world's largest cacao producer, was approximately $2 billion. The companies that transform cacao into chocolate capture roughly 70% of the value created in the chocolate supply chain. The farmers who grow the raw material capture roughly 3 to 6%. This is not an accident of the market. It is the result of deliberate corporate strategy. Chocolate companies have consistently opposed attempts to establish minimum prices for cacao that would allow farmers to earn a living wage. They have consistently opposed binding regulations that would require them to verify their supply chains are free of child labor. They have consistently preferred voluntary commitments and industry-led programs, which have comprehensively failed for 20 years, to enforceable standards. In 2021, The United States Supreme Court ruled on a case brought by former child trafficking victims from Mali against Nestlé USA in Cargill. The court ruled on a narrow jurisdictional question, not on the merits. It did not find that the companies were innocent. It found that American courts were not the appropriate venue for the claim. The case was effectively dismissed without the underlying facts being adjudicated. The children who brought the case remained without remedy. Nestlé and Cargill continued operating as before. The Aztec priests who consumed chocolate in their sacred ceremonies believed that cacao was a gift from Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god, stolen from paradise and given to humanity. The consumption of chocolate was an act of communion with the divine. It was surrounded by ritual, by restriction, by reverence. The idea that chocolate could be made cheaply in vast quantities by children working without pay in conditions of coercion and sold in brightly colored packages for the equivalent of loose change would have been incomprehensible to them, not because they were naive about suffering. The Aztec Empire was built on conquest, tribute, and human sacrifice. They understood coercion, but cacao was sacred. And what the modern chocolate industry has done to cacao is a form of desecration that even the Aztec priests might have recognized. A substance that was once the exclusive communion of kings and gods is now mass-produced. The mass production requires cheap raw material. The cheap raw material requires cheap labor. The cheap labor means children with machetes in tropical heat. The children with machetes produce the cacao that becomes the chocolate that is sold at checkout counters in every supermarket in the world. The entire chain is visible. It has been visible for 20 years. And the companies at the top of that chain have chosen year after year, decade after decade, to accept the profits and defer the reform. Not bad for a bitter seed from a jungle in southern Mexico, a seed that was once so sacred that consuming it without royal authority was an offense against the gods. That was stolen by an empire that had crossed an ocean looking for gold and found something worth more. That was sweetened, refined, and transformed into the most beloved confection in human history. That built the fortunes of some of the largest corporations on Earth. And that is still, today, in the 21st century, being harvested by children who were trafficked from their families and sold to farmers who cannot afford to pay adult wages because the corporations that buy their cacao have spent 20 years ensuring that they never have to pay more. The hidden curse of chocolate is not hidden at all. It is in every bar of chocolate you have ever eaten. It is in every box of cocoa on every kitchen shelf. It is in every hot drink on every cafe menu. The curse is not that this happened. The curse is that we know, and the chocolate is still there, and we still buy it. If this story changed how you see the world, subscribe to Dark Crop, because every week we pull back the curtain on the foods that built civilization, the ones with blood on their labels, the ones they never told you about, the ones hiding in plain sight, on every shelf, in every store, in every hand.